December 1895. Western North Carolina. The air in the Blue Ridge Mountains carries the smell of freshly cut limestone and wet plaster. More than 1,000 workers move through a construction site so vast it resembles a medieval city rising from nothing. Masons from Europe guide American laborers in techniques not seen in this country before. Steam-powered cranes lift blocks of Indiana limestone that weigh several tons each. The estate's private railway spur brings in carved oak paneling from workshops in Philadelphia, marble from Italy, tapestries purchased from French chateaux. The main house, still months from completion, already dwarfs every private residence in America. A young man stands on the unfinished loggia, looking out over thousands of acres of transformed wilderness. George Washington Vanderbilt is 32 years old. He has never worked a day for wages in his life. The fortune funding this construction came from his grandfather, a man who died before George was born. That grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, built an empire from ferry boats and railways through methods that made him the richest man in America and one of the most ruthless. The money George inherited represents a fraction of that original fortune, already divided among dozens of heirs, but it remains incomprehensible in scale. George speaks French, German, and Italian. He's read more books than most university professors. He employs an architect who studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, a landscape designer who created Central Park, and a forester who trained in the scientific forestry schools of Europe. The house he is building contains 250 rooms. It will have electricity, central heating, refrigeration, elevators, an indoor swimming pool, a bowling alley, and a private library of 22,000 volumes. The construction cost, in $1,895, will exceed $5 million. Adjusted for inflation, that approaches $200 million today, but the comparison fails to capture the reality. There is no market for such a thing. No one builds houses like this anymore. Not in America, perhaps not anywhere. The question forming in the mountain air that December, unspoken but present in the minds of contractors and craftsmen, in the letters of George's siblings and the private thoughts of his mother, is simple and terrible. What does it cost to keep a thing like this alive? The numbers, when you confront them directly, resist comprehension. Biltmore House, the structure at the center of George Vanderbilt's vision, contains 178,000 square feet of interior space. 4 acres of floor under one roof. The basement alone covers an area equivalent to a modern supermarket. 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces. The banquet hall rises 75 feet to a barrel-vaulted ceiling supported by carved oak beams, each weighing 2 tons. The library holds 16,000 books when the house opens, a collection that will grow to 22,000, including first editions and illuminated manuscripts dating to the 15th century. The Palm Court, an indoor garden with a glass roof, creates a controlled tropical environment in the mountains of North Carolina. The estate itself encompasses 125,000 acres. When George begins purchasing land in 1888, that is nearly 200 square miles, an area larger than the city of Philadelphia. Within this boundary, Vanderbilt creates a working landscape. Forests managed according to European scientific principles, farms producing crops, and livestock, dairies, nurseries, a brick kiln, a woodworking shop, a private railway connecting to the Southern Railway's main line. The approach road from the entrance gate to the house runs 3 miles through designed landscapes that transition from native forest to managed woodland to formal gardens. Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect, shapes the terrain to create views that appear natural but result from precise manipulation of topography, vegetation, and sight lines. The construction phase alone employs more than 1,000 people at its peak. Masons, carpenters, plasterers, stone carvers, electricians, plumbers, painters, glazers. Richard Morse Hunt, the architect, maintains offices in both New York and at the construction site. He brings in European craftsmen to train American workers in techniques required for the level of detail Vanderbilt demands. The stone carving on the exterior takes years. Each limestone block is cut, shaped, and fitted by hand. The interior woodwork, executed by George Vanderbilt's personal cabinet makers in Philadelphia, involves carving and joining so complex that modern craftsmen study it as a lost art. The chateau-style roof uses slate from quarries in New York, each piece cut and placed to create patterns visible only from the upper windows. When the house opens on Christmas Eve, 1895, it functions as a self-contained world. The basement contains the infrastructure: boiler rooms with 8 steam boilers to heat the entire structure, refrigeration equipment using an ammonia compression system, electrical generators, storage vaults for wine and provisions, kitchens with cast iron ranges and ovens, laundry facilities, servants' dining rooms and sitting areas. The first floor presents the public face: the entrance hall with its limestone walls and coffered ceiling, the library with its 2-story height and hidden spiral staircase, the music room with a pipe organ, the banquet hall that can seat 64 at a single table. The second floor holds family bedrooms and guest suites. The third floor contains additional guest rooms and servants' quarters. The basement and sub-basement provide workspace and infrastructure that make the visible elegance possible. The mechanical systems alone represent engineering at the edge of what's possible in the 1890s. The electrical system, powered by on-site generators before the house connects to commercial power, supplies lighting throughout the building and power for electric call buttons in every major room. The heating system circulates steam through miles of pipes to radiators sized for each space. The plumbing brings water from a reservoir built specifically for the estate, with pressure maintained by elevation and pumping stations. The fire suppression system includes hose connections throughout the building. The kitchen equipment includes an electric dumbwaiter, multiple ovens, a rotisserie, an ice cream maker, and a walk-in refrigerator. George Vanderbilt doesn't build this in isolation. He is the youngest grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, who died in 1877 with a fortune estimated at $100 million. It's the largest ever accumulated in America to that point. Cornelius left 95% of that fortune to William Henry Vanderbilt, George's father, who doubled it to nearly $200 million in the 8 years before his own death in 1885. The fortune then divided among William's 8 children, with George receiving approximately $10 million in cash and securities. That inheritance generates income of roughly $400,000 per year at conservative investment rates. By comparison, a skilled craftsman in 1890 earns perhaps $800 annually. George's passive income equals the lifetime earnings of 500 skilled workers. The other Vanderbilt heirs follow a predictable pattern. They build houses, dozens of them, each trying to exceed the others in scale and opulence. Cornelius Vanderbilt, too, builds the Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, 70 rooms on 13 acres. William Kissam Vanderbilt builds Marble House, also in Newport, at a cost of $11 million. Alva Vanderbilt, William's wife, insists on a ballroom that can accommodate 1,200 guests. Frederick Vanderbilt builds a Hyde Park mansion overlooking the Hudson River. The family's New York City residences line Fifth Avenue, each one competing for attention, each requiring a staff of dozens, each consuming fortunes in maintenance and operation. George chooses differently. He builds in North Carolina, far from New York society, on land that costs almost nothing because the post-Civil War South remains economically devastated. He builds the largest house, yes, but surrounds it with a functioning landscape designed to demonstrate principles of conservation and scientific management. Where his siblings build for display, George builds for purpose, or at least convinces himself he does. The hidden machinery reveals itself in payroll records and operational documents that survive in the estate's archives. In 1900, 5 years after the house opens, Biltmore employs approximately 80 people on permanent staff. This breaks down into distinct categories, each with its own hierarchy and compensation structure. The house staff includes a butler, under-butler, footman, valets, a head housekeeper, assistant housekeepers, chambermaids, laundry maids, kitchen staff, scullery maids. The butler, the highest-ranking servant, earns $75 per month plus room and board. Footmen earn $30 monthly. Chambermaids receive $15 plus their keep. The laundry staff, considered lower status, earns $12. These wages place Biltmore's staff among the better compensated household servants in America. But the work remains exhausting, and the hours extend from before dawn until after the family retires. A chambermaid's day begins at 5:30. She lights fires in the family bedrooms before the Vanderbilts wake, empties chamber pots, carries hot water for washing, makes beds, dusts furniture, sweeps floors, cleans windows, polishes brass, blacks the grates. Each bedroom requires at least an hour of work. A maid assigned to 3 guest rooms works steadily until late morning breaks for a meal in the servants' dining room, then continues with afternoon tasks, turning down beds, refilling water pitchers, emptying wastebaskets, maintaining the endless cleanliness required in a house where dust from the fireplace in one room could and be allowed to appear in another. A fingerprint on a doorknob, a wrinkle in a bedspread, a candle burned unevenly, any of these can result in discipline or dismissal. The kitchen operates on a military schedule. Breakfast service begins at 8. The family and guests expect food cooked to order, eggs exactly as requested, toast at the correct temperature, fruit perfectly arranged. Lunch service starts at 1, tea at 4, dinner at 8. Between these formal meals, the kitchen provides food for the servants' meals, prepares items for afternoon visitors, maintains stocks of baked goods and preserves, processes produce from the estate's gardens. The head chef commands a staff of 6, plus scullery maids who wash dishes and clean the work surfaces. The kitchen runs 12 hours minimum, longer when the Vanderbilts entertain. The laundry occupies an entire section of the basement. Bed linens change daily, bath towels after each use. The family's clothing requires specialized care, delicate fabrics hand-washed, white items bleached and sun-dried, colored garments treated separately, irons heat on stoves kept burning through the day. The work is hot, damp, and exhausting. Laundry maids suffer from respiratory problems, skin damage from lye soap, chronic fatigue. They are young women, mostly local, who work until marriage or illness forces them to stop. The turnover rate runs high. Beyond the house staff, the estate employs gardeners, groundskeepers, foresters, farmers, dairymen, stable hands, drivers, mechanics. The formal gardens require constant maintenance: weeding, pruning, planting, edging, mowing, watering. The greenhouse staff propagates plants, tends exotic species, prepares cut flowers for the house. The estate produces its own vegetables, fruit, milk, butter, cheese, eggs, poultry, beef, pork. This requires land under cultivation, livestock tended daily, barns maintained, equipment repaired. The forestry operation, under the direction of Gifford Pinchot and later Carl Schenck, employs lumberjacks, sawyers, teamsters. The goal is sustainable yield, proving that scientific forestry can produce profit while maintaining the forest's health. But the immediate reality involves hard physical labor in all weather. The private railway spur requires a station master, switchman, maintenance crew. The road system within the estate needs grading and repair. The water system, the electrical system, the heating plant each needs skilled workers for operation and maintenance. The total permanent staff approaches 150 people when the estate operates at full capacity, not counting temporary laborers hired for harvest or construction projects. The annual operating cost exceeds $250,000 by 1900. This includes payroll, supplies, fuel, repairs, taxes, insurance, professional fees for the architect and landscape designers who remain on retainer. George's annual income from his inheritance, approximately $400,000, covers this with margin, but provides little extra for capital improvements or expansion. The estate doesn't generate significant revenue. The forests will eventually produce income from timber sales, but the forestry program operates at a loss during its establishment phase. The farms supply the house, but don't sell produce commercially. Biltmore exists as a demonstration of what private wealth can create, not as a business in any conventional sense. The human cost compounds in ways not captured by payroll figures. Servants work 6.5 days per week. Sunday afternoon provides their only guaranteed free time. They live on the estate, in rooms that are clean and dry but small and shared. Privacy barely exists. The social hierarchy within the staff is rigid.
Upper.
Servants don't socialize with lower servants. Male and female staff occupy separate wings. Romantic relationships between staff members are discouraged. Marriage means resignation. The work is secure by standards of the time, and the conditions are better than in many factories or farms, but the life is constrained and physically wearing. Accidents happen. A worker falls from scaffolding during maintenance and breaks his back. A stableman gets kicked by a horse and loses the use of his arm. A kitchen maid burns herself severely, and carries scars the rest of her life. A forester dies when a tree falls the wrong way during logging. The estate provides some medical care, sometimes continues wages for a period during recovery. But there's no systematic compensation for permanent disability and no pension system for retirement. Workers who become unable to continue must rely on family or charity. The psychological cost is harder to document but present in letters and journals that survive. Servants describe the loneliness of living surrounded by people but always maintaining professional distance. They write about homesickness, about missing family events, about watching the Vanderbilts' lives of ease while working until exhaustion. Some express pride in their skills and the estate's beauty. Others reveal quiet bitterness about the inequality, the unfairness of birth, determining everything. These tensions remain mostly hidden during George's lifetime, submerged beneath the requirements of service and the economic necessity that keeps people in positions they might otherwise leave. George Washington Vanderbilt, too, doesn't fit the pattern of his generation. Whereas older brothers pursue business and social prominence, George withdraws into scholarship. He collects books obsessively from adolescence, building a personal library that eventually rivals many universities. He studies languages, art, history, architecture, landscape design, forestry. He travels frequently in Europe, visiting estates and gardens, purchasing furniture and art, developing tastes that run toward the Renaissance rather than contemporary fashion. His diaries and letters reveal someone more comfortable with ideas than people, or interested in creating something lasting than in the social competition that obsesses the rest of his family. The decision to build in North Carolina, rather than Newport or the Hudson Valley, where the other Vanderbilts concentrate, reflects this difference. George visits Asheville in 1888 on the recommendation of doctors who believe the mountain air might help his mother's health. He sees the cut-over forests, the eroded hillsides, the poverty of the post-war South. Where others might see desolation, he sees opportunity. The land is cheap, the climate favorable, the landscape spectacular. More importantly, it's empty of the society he finds suffocating in New York. He begins purchasing land in small parcels, working through agents to avoid driving up prices. The property assembles slowly, abandoned farms, logged-over forest, whole mountainsides. Within 5 years, he controls 125,000 acres, an area approaching the size of a small kingdom. The scale is deliberate. George wants enough land to create a complete environment to demonstrate integrated management of forest, farm, and residence. He corresponds with foresters in Germany and France, studying their methods. He reads everything published on scientific forestry, landscape design, agricultural improvement. The decision to hire Gifford Pinchot as the estate's forester reveals George's intentions. Pinchot, trained in Europe, becomes the first professional forester practicing in America. He arrives at Biltmore in 1892 with ideas considered radical. Forests should be managed for sustained yield. Cut selectively rather than clear-cut, replanted systematically, protected from fire and disease. Timber should be harvested, yes, but in ways that maintain the forest's ability to regenerate. The goal is perpetual productivity, not maximum immediate profit. These principles, obvious now, were revolutionary in an America that treated forests as inexhaustible resources to be mined and abandoned. George funds this experiment from private wealth, expecting no return, driven by a mixture of genuine scientific interest and patrician obligation. He believes, or says he believes, that large landowners have a duty to demonstrate responsible management. If the rich won't model conservation, who will? The logic is self-serving. It assumes the right of vast private estates while claiming they serve public benefit, but the practical results matter. Under Pinchot's direction, Biltmore's forests become a training ground for American forestry. When Pinchot leaves to become the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service, his replacement, Carl Schenck, establishes the Biltmore Forest School, the first school of forestry in America. Hundreds of young men train there before going on to careers managing public and private forests across the country. It's a psychological profile that emerges from George's letters and from accounts by people who knew him shows someone aware of his position as contradictions. He knows he didn't earn his fortune. He knows the house he's building is excessive by any rational measure. He constructs elaborate justifications. The house will demonstrate American craftsmanship. The estate will advance scientific knowledge. the employment will benefit the local economy. These justifications carry some truth, but do not resolve the fundamental question of whether one person should control such resources. George never confronts this question directly in his surviving writings. Instead, he focuses on details: the correct height for a retaining wall, the proper species mix for a reforestation area, the arrangement of books in his library. His marriage to Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in 1898 introduces a partner with a different background and perspective. Edith comes from an old New York family with social position but little money. She has worked unusual for her class as a companion and secretary. She's practical where George is theoretical, socially confident where he's reserved, interested in people where he prefers books. The marriage appears genuinely affectionate. Their daughter Cornelia is born in 1900, the only child they will have. Edith begins to influence estate operations almost immediately. She notices the poor housing conditions in the nearby communities. It's the lack of schools and medical care, the isolation of mountain families. She establishes a school, funds a hospital, creates programs to teach domestic skills, and provide employment for local women. These efforts operate from the same patrician assumption as George's forestry experiments that the wealthy have an obligation to uplift the less fortunate. But they address immediate human needs in practical ways. Edith sees the estate as embedded in a community, not isolated from it, and she pushes George to recognize obligations beyond his property boundaries. The Vanderbilts' life at Biltmore, when they're in residence, follows patterns that seem bizarre from a modern perspective. They occupy a tiny fraction of the house's space, a few bedrooms. The library, the music room, occasionally the banquet hall for large dinners. 80% of the structure exists for guests, for display, for the possibility of use rather than actual use. They employ dozens of people to maintain spaces that sit empty most of the year. They dress formally for dinner, even when eating alone, served by footmen who stand waiting throughout the meal. The entire apparatus exists to support a lifestyle that requires constant performance of wealth. Yet George also spends hours in his library, genuinely reading and studying. He rides through the forests daily, inspecting plantings, and discussing management with his foresters. He involves himself in architectural details, garden designs, livestock breeding programs. The engagement appears authentic, not merely the pretense of interest common among the idle rich. He seems to believe he's building something meaningful, something that justifies the expenditure and the inequality. The contradiction never resolves. George lives surrounded by luxury while preaching conservation. He employs hundreds at low wages while speaking of social responsibility. He owns more land than most people will see in a lifetime while advocating for public forests. These tensions exist in his time without creating the cognitive dissonance they might today. The progressive era operates on the assumption that enlightened elites can and should guide social improvement. George fits comfortably within this framework, never questioning whether the framework itself might be the problem. The costs compound in ways that become clear only gradually. The initial construction and landscaping consume approximately $6 million by 1900, adjusted. For inflation, that approaches $200 million in today's currency, but the comparison misleads. In 1900, $6 million represents an appreciable fraction of the national economy. Cornelius Vanderbilt's original fortune of $100 million. At the time of his death in 1877, equaled roughly 1/9 of the entire federal budget. The Vanderbilt wealth operates at a scale where individual projects affect regional economies. The annual operating costs exceeding $250,000 must be paid regardless of whether George lives at Biltmore or travels in Europe. The staff requires wages every month. The infrastructure needs constant maintenance. Roofs leak and must be repaired. Masonry cracks from freeze-thaw cycles. Wood deteriorates. Mechanical systems fail. The house sits in a climate of hot summers and cold winters, with temperature swings that stress materials. Humidity promotes mold and rust. The estate's remote location means every repair requires transporting materials and specialized workers from distant cities. The forestry operations lose money through their first decade. Scientific forestry requires investment that won't yield returns for years. Selective cutting produces less immediate revenue than clear cutting. Replanting costs money with no short-term payback. Pincho, and later Schenck, pursue their experiments with George's financial backing, proving their methods work but not generating profit. The estate's sawmill processes timber from the managed forests, but the operation barely covers its costs. The goal is demonstration, not profit, but demonstration consumes capital that generates no return. The agricultural operations fare slightly better, but still operate at a loss when fully accounted. Estate's farms produce food for the house and staff, reducing grocery expenses. But the investment in land, equipment, livestock, and labor exceeds the value of the produce. A purely economic analysis would show that buying food on the open market would cost less than producing it on the estate. But economic rationality isn't the point. George wants a complete, self-contained environment, and that requires farms regardless of their profitability. Property taxes add another burden. North Carolina taxes land at rates low by northern standards, but 125,000 acres still generates significant tax bills. The house itself, assessed at over $1 million, carries substantial annual taxes. George pays without complaint. The amounts are manageable given his income, but the taxes represent a permanent obligation that will continue regardless of the family's financial situation in future years. Insurance costs reflect the unique risks. The house contains irreplaceable art and furnishings worth millions. Fire remains a constant danger despite the fire suppression systems. Wind can damage the roof. Lightning can strike. Insurers charge premiums that reflect both the value at risk and the difficulty of replacing unique items. The policies run to hundreds of pages, specifying coverage for individual paintings, tapestries, pieces of furniture, books. The human costs evolve as the estate matures. The initial construction workforce disperses when building completes. But some workers transition to permanent positions in maintenance and operations. Others find they cut and return to their previous lives after years of steady employment at relatively good wages. The local economy has adjusted to Biltmore's presence. Businesses have opened to supply the estate. Families have moved to the area for work. The estate becomes an economic engine for the region, which creates a kind of dependency. If Biltmore were to close, hundreds of people would lose their livelihoods in an area with few alternative employment options. The psychological costs for the Vanderbilts themselves appear in subtle ways. George's letters from the early 1900s show increasing concern about money. His inheritance, while vast, isn't infinite. The estate's costs consume most of his income. Market downturns reduce investment returns. Unexpected expenses arise constantly. He begins selling portions of the forest land, retaining the core estate but reducing the total acreage. He considers commercial ventures that might generate revenue. A dairy that would sell to Asheville. A nursery to sell plants. A more aggressive timber program. None of these ideas fully develops, but their presence in his correspondence reveals growing unease. Edith's letters show different concerns. She worries about Cornelia growing up in an environment so detached from normal life. She sees how the staff's children lack educational opportunities. She notices the poverty in surrounding communities and feels the awkwardness of the contrast between Biltmore's opulence and the hardship just beyond its gates. She pushes for programs that address these issues, but she also recognizes the limited scope of what private charity can achieve. Her worldview is shifting, though she doesn't yet articulate it fully, toward seeing wealth as carrying obligations that can't be satisfied through enlightened management of one's own property. The estate exists in a kind of equilibrium through the first decade of the 1900s. Costs remain high, but manageable. The forestry programs begin to show results. The landscape matures into the designed beauty Olmsted envisioned. The house functions as George intended, a place for learning, reflection, and demonstration of what American craftsmanship can achieve when supported by adequate resources. Visitors come, carefully selected, and leave impressed. The experiment seems sustainable, but sustainability under 1910 conditions assumes stability in the broader world. It assumes George's income will continue at current levels, that taxes won't increase significantly, that no major financial disruptions will occur, that George himself will live to manage the estate for decades. None of these assumptions will prove correct. The first external force arrives quietly. George Washington Vanderbilt II dies on March 6, 1914, in Washington, D.C., following emergency surgery for appendicitis. He is 51 years old. He has owned Biltmore for 26 years, lived in the completed house for 18. His death is sudden, unexpected, and creates immediate complications. The estate passes to Edith. George's will leaves her Biltmore insufficient assets to generate income for maintenance, with the property ultimately to pass to their daughter Cornelia when she comes of age. The arrangement seems straightforward but immediately reveals problems. The estate tax, recently enacted as part of the federal income tax system, applies to inherited wealth. The government assesses the estate's value at several $1,000,000. How the tax bill exceeds what Edith can pay from liquid assets. She must sell property to meet the obligation. The sales begin immediately. Edith negotiates with the federal government to purchase much of the forest land for the Pisgah National Forest, one of the first national forests in the eastern United States. The deal makes sense on multiple levels. It provides the cash Edith needs, preserves the forests George and his foresters work to restore, and creates public access to land that had been private. But it also represents the beginning of the estate's contraction, the 125,000 acres reduced to about 30,000. The vision of a completely integrated landscape, forest and farm and residence operating as one system ends. Biltmore becomes a large estate rather than a small principality. Edith manages through World War I by economizing. Staff reductions occur gradually, through attrition rather than mass firings. Some sections of the house close. The entertainment schedule reduces. The estate still functions, but at a smaller scale, with less ambition. Edith focuses on maintaining the core, the house, the immediate gardens, enough land to preserve the essential character of the place. Her instincts prove sound. Biltmore survives the war years while many other large estates struggle or close. The 1920s bring different pressures. Tax rates increase under the Revenue Acts passed to pay down war debt. Operating costs rise with post-war inflation. The servant problem, as it's called in the press, becomes acute. Fewer people want domestic service positions when factory work and office jobs offer more freedom and better pay. Biltmore struggles to maintain full staff. Positions go unfilled. Standards slip slightly, not enough for visitors to notice, but enough that Edith and the senior staff feel the decline. The estate's isolation, once an advantage, becomes a liability. Asheville has grown, but it remains a small southern city with limited cultural amenities. Cornelia, coming of age in the 1920s, finds Biltmore stifling. She marries in 1924 to John Francis Amherst Cecil, a British diplomat. The wedding held at Biltmore attracts national attention, the last great Vanderbilt wedding, the press calls it. Cornelia and John settle at Biltmore, taking over daily management while Edith gradually steps back. They have two sons, George and William, born in 1925 and 1928. For a moment, the future seems assured. A new generation will inherit, the line will continue, Biltmore will endure. Then October 1929 arrives. The stock market crash destroys paper fortunes overnight. The Vanderbilt wealth, invested primarily in stocks and bonds, loses value catastrophically. Income from investments, which has funded Biltmore's operations, collapses. Dividend payments stop. Bond interest becomes uncertain. The estate's financial foundation cracks. The depression that follows creates cascading failures. Property values plummet. Land that might have been sold to raise cash becomes nearly unsaleable. Banks fail, taking accounts with them. The few commercial ventures the estate had developed, dairy selling milk in Asheville. Timber sales to local mills lose their markets as the regional economy implodes. Asheville itself faces disaster. Its municipal government defaults on bonds. Its major bank closes. Unemployment reaches desperate levels. Biltmore cuts deeper. Staff reductions accelerate. Salaries for remaining workers decrease. More sections of the house close. Maintenance defers. Small repairs become major problems as leaks damage plaster and wallpaper. The garden's simplify, less labor-intensive plantings replace the elaborate designs. The estate's farms produce food for the house and remaining staff but generate no income. The forestry operations, which had finally begun to show profit, continue but at reduced scale. Cornelia and John's marriage deteriorates. The pressure of managing the estate during the Depression, the isolation, the constant financial worry all contribute to growing tension. They separate in 1934, though divorce won't come until later. Cornelia eventually leaves Biltmore permanently, moving first to New York, then to England. The sons remain with their grandmother Edith, who resumes active management. She's in her 60s, managing a vast property during the worst economic collapse in American history, essentially alone. The property tax has become the immediate crisis. North Carolina raises rates to compensate for declining revenues. Biltmore's assessment reflects its pre-depression value. Edith can't pay. She negotiates delays, sells more land, but the problem persists. By the mid-1930s, the situation approaches critical. The estate faces potential seizure for unpaid taxes. Several other Vanderbilt properties have already been sold or demolished. Cornelius Vanderbilt II's massive New York mansion on Fifth Avenue comes down in 1927 to make room for commercial development. The trend accelerates through the Depression, as families who can't afford to maintain vast houses simply abandon them. Edith recognizes that Biltmore in its current form cannot survive. The 19th century model of the private estate, supported by inherited wealth and cheap labor, is dying. The economic and social conditions that made such places possible are gone. The tax structure of the modern state makes them increasingly untenable. The cultural shifts of the 20th century make them seem absurd. No one builds houses like Biltmore anymore. Increasingly, no one can afford to keep the ones that exist. The reckoning comes clearly into focus by 1935. Continuation in the original form is impossible. Something must change, or Biltmore will follow the pattern of demolition and dispersal that is consuming the other Vanderbilt properties. The house that was supposed to last forever faces extinction within 40 years of its completion. Edith Vanderbilt makes the decision that will save Biltmore, though at the time it seems like defeat. She will open the house to paying visitors. The idea is not new. Several European estates have operated as tourist attractions for decades. A few American properties have tentatively moved in this direction. But for a Vanderbilt, for the family that epitomized American wealth and exclusivity, the step represents profound loss. The house George built as a private retreat, a place to escape the public eye, will become a public spectacle. The estate designed to demonstrate what private wealth can achieve will survive only by inviting the masses to pay for the privilege of viewing it. The decision is pragmatic, not romantic. Edith runs the numbers with her advisors. The estate needs income to cover operating costs and taxes. The only asset that can generate income without being sold is the house itself. Tourism is growing as automobiles make travel accessible to the middle class. The mountains of North Carolina are becoming a destination. Asheville needs economic recovery and is actively promoting itself as a tourist town. Biltmore, as the largest private residence in America, has intrinsic appeal. People will pay to see it, if given the chance. The first tours begin in 1930, on a limited basis. Edith opens only a few rooms on the first floor. She charges $1 per person, proceeds to benefit the Asheville Welfare Association. The framing is important. This is charity, not commerce. The Vanderbilts are helping the community, not running a business. Distinction is psychological, but necessary. Edith needs to preserve some sense that the family is above mere commercial concerns, even as they literally sell access to their home. The response exceeds expectations. Thousands of people come in the first year. They marvel at the house's scale, the art, the furnishings, the beauty of the gardens. They respect the space more than Edith feared they might. The revenue, while modest, matters. It covers a portion of the operating costs. More importantly, it demonstrates viability. This might actually work. The operation expands carefully through the 1930s. More rooms open, tour routes extend. The gardens receive emphasis. They're spectacular and easier to maintain than the house interior. A tea room opens, then a gift shop. These additions feel like compromises, even violations, but they generate revenue that keeps the estate functioning. The staff begins to shift from traditional household servants to something more like museum workers and hospitality employees. The skills required are different. Instead of serving the family in private, workers now guide visitors, answer questions, maintain public spaces, manage crowds. World War II brings unexpected salvation. The National Gallery of Art in Washington, fearing bombing or sabotage, seeks secure storage for its most valuable paintings. Biltmore offers space. For several years, the house shelters works by Rembrandt, Vermeer, and other masters, creating a temporary museum of extraordinary importance. The arrangement brings prestige, rental income, and national attention. It also establishes Biltmore's credibility as a serious institution, not merely a curiosity. When the paintings returned to Washington after the war, Biltmore has transformed in public perception from a private home to a cultural asset. The post-war years see increasing professionalization. William Cecil, George, and Edith's grandson takes over management after completing naval service. He approaches Biltmore as a business problem, not a sentimental legacy. He studies other historic houses that operate as tourist attractions. He hires professional managers, invests in marketing and visitor amenities. He expands the ticket operations, develops special events, creates seasonal attractions. He's unsentimental about changes required for survival. For rooms, historic furnishings must be rearranged to accommodate tour flow, so be it. Modern restrooms must be installed. Despite aesthetic compromises, they're necessary. If gift shops must sell items that would horrify his great-grandfather, that's the price of continuation. William's vision proves correct. Attendance grows steadily through the 1950s and 1960s. Biltmore becomes a major North Carolina tourist destination. Revenue covers operating costs with surplus for reinvestment. The deferred maintenance from the Depression years can finally be addressed. Roofs are repaired, masonry repoints, mechanical systems update. The house stabilizes physically even as its function transforms completely. The transformation continues through the late 20th century. Biltmore adds a winery in the 1980s, capitalizing on the estate's agricultural tradition and the growing American interest in wine. The winery becomes extremely successful, eventually producing hundreds of thousands of cases annually. A luxury hotel opens on the grounds in 2001. Restaurants multiply. The estate develops into a hospitality complex that happens to include a historic house, rather than a historic house that happens to admit visitors. The distinction matters. The revenue model shifts from admission tickets to a diversified portfolio of tourism and hospitality businesses. By the early 21st century, Biltmore employs more than 2,000 people, the largest private employer in the region. Annual visitors exceed 1 million. Revenue approaches $200 million. The estate functions as a for-profit business owned by the Cecil family. George Vanderbilt's descendants, operating under corporate structures designed to minimize taxes and maximize flexibility. The house itself, preserved under conservation easements that limit changes to its historic fabric, represents only a fraction of the economic activity. The adaptation succeeded, but at a cost measured in transformation. The house George Vanderbilt built as a private sanctuary, where he could escape public attention and pursue his interests in books and forestry and landscape design, now hosts over 1 million visitors annually. The rooms where he read quietly are traversed by tour groups. The gardens where he walked in solitude are filled with tourists taking photographs. The estate he designed as a demonstration of integrated land management has become an entertainment destination with a wine bar, a hotel, restaurants, and gift shops selling tchotchke that would have appalled him. This is not failure exactly. The house survives, where the core landscape remains intact. The architecture and furnishings are maintained to museum standards. Future generations can visit and understand something of what George created, but the animating purpose is gone. Biltmore operates now purely for continuation, for its own survival, not for any larger vision of conservation or demonstration. It's a business success and a preservation victory, which makes it simultaneously an adaptation and a kind of defeat. The modern reality of Biltmore Estate is complex and carefully managed. The property, reduced to about 8,000 acres from the original 125,000, remains private land owned by the Biltmore Company, a corporation held by William Cecil's descendants. The company employs professional management and operates multiple business units. The house museum attracts the visitors and provides the brand, but the winery and hospitality operations generate much of the revenue. The visitor experience is carefully choreographed. Guests purchase timed tickets, often weeks in advance during peak seasons. They pay $50 to $90 per adult depending on season, with higher prices at Christmas when the house receives elaborate decorations. They park in vast lots and take shuttles to the house, They enter through a modern visitor center designed to manage crowds and maximize retail opportunities before people even see the historic structure. The tour routes through the house accommodate hundreds of people per hour, managed by staff who keep groups moving at calculated paces to prevent bottlenecks. The experience is efficient, educational, pleasant, and bears no resemblance to the home's original use. The economics work because of scale. 1 million visitors at $70 each generates $70 million in admission revenue alone. Add wine sales, restaurant revenue, hotel income, retail operations, and the total approaches $200 million annually. Operating costs are substantial, maintaining the house and grounds, staff in all operations, marketing, insurance, taxes, but the profit margin is healthy. Biltmore succeeds financially in a way it never did as a private residence. The preservation standards are high. The house operates under conservation easements held by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. These legal agreements restrict changes to the building's historic fabric and significant landscape features. The company can't demolish or significantly alter protected elements without approval. In exchange, the easements provide tax benefits and ensure the house will remain intact regardless of future ownership changes. Professional conservators maintain the collections. Climate control systems protect furnishings and art. Security is sophisticated. The house is in better physical condition now than at most points in its history. But preservation creates its own tensions. The house must accommodate visitors while protecting fragile materials. Carpets wear from foot traffic. Light damages textiles and paintings. Humidity from breath and body heat affects woodwork and books. The conservation staff constantly balances access against preservation. Some rooms remain closed to protect them. Others use reproduction furnishings in place of originals too fragile for exposure. Lighting adjusts to minimize damage while providing adequate visibility. Glass barriers protect certain areas. The compromises are necessary, but they accumulate, gradually making the house less authentic, even as preservation techniques become more sophisticated. The landscape faces similar challenges. The formal gardens near the house receive intensive maintenance and remain spectacular. But the outer areas, the forests and farms George considered integral to his vision, have largely returned to nature or converted to other uses. The forestry demonstration areas are gone. The agricultural operations are minimal. The landscape serves primarily as a scenic backdrop for the house and hospitality operations. Olmsted's carefully designed approach, meant to transition gradually from wild forest to managed landscape to formal garden, has been simplified and in some areas abandoned. Maintaining the full designed landscape would require resources that don't generate revenue. So the focus concentrates on what visitors see and experience directly. The tax situation, which nearly destroyed the estate in the 1930s, remains complex. The company pays property taxes on the full acreage and improvements. North Carolina assesses the property at hundreds of millions of dollars. The annual tax bill exceeds $10 million. The conservation easements provide some reduction. And the company's for-profit structure allows depreciation and other deductions. But the tax burden is substantial and permanent. The state has no incentive to reduce rates. Biltmore can afford to pay, and the revenue supports local schools and services. The relationship is symbiotic, but also precarious. If tourism declines significantly, if the business model falters, the tax obligation could once again threaten the estate's survival. The employment picture is very different from the early 20th century. The modern staff includes tour guides, retail workers, restaurant employees, hotel staff, groundskeepers, conservation specialists, marketing professionals, financial managers, event coordinators, security personnel. The jobs are professional and relatively well-paying by regional standards. Benefits include health insurance, retirement plans, paid leave. The company has become a model employer. But the work is fundamentally different from the servant positions of George's time. The relationship between employer and employee is transactional and professional. Rather than the semi-feudal arrangement of the original household staff, people work at Biltmore, but don't live their lives within its orbit the way servants once did. The estate's economic impact on the region is substantial. Biltmore accounts for a significant portion of Asheville's tourism economy. Hotels, restaurants, shops, and other businesses benefit from the visitors Biltmore attracts. The estate's success has enabled Asheville's transformation from a declining industrial city to a thriving tourism and retirement destination. Property values have risen. Development has accelerated. The city's character has changed completely, largely because Biltmore survived and adapted rather than closing or declining. This success creates its own problems: affordability, traffic, overcrowding, the loss of the small-town character that once defined the area. The estate that George built to escape urban life has helped create urban pressures in a place that was once rural. The family's relationship to the estate has evolved across generations. William Cecil and his brother George both remained connected to Biltmore and involved in its management until late in life. Their children have various levels of engagement. Some work actively in company operations, others maintain ownership stakes, but pursue separate careers. The emotional attachment varies. For some, Biltmore represents heritage and identity. For others, it's a business asset and family obligation. This evolution is natural across 4 generations, but it marks another departure from George's vision. He imagined his descendants living at Biltmore, embedded in the landscape, continuing his work. Instead, they manage it from a distance, as executives rather than as residents. The tension between preservation and commerce plays out in hundreds of small decisions. Should the estate host weddings in the gardens? Revenue is substantial, and weddings don't damage the landscape. But George Vanderbilt built Biltmore as a private retreat, and turning it into a wedding venue seems like a betrayal of that intention. Should the winery expand production to meet growing demand? The wine program honors the estate's agricultural tradition. But George never intended commercial wine production on this scale. Should the estate develop additional hotel accommodations to capture more tourism spending? The income would support preservation, but more buildings mean more impact on the historic landscape. The company generally resolves these tensions in favor of sustainability and revenue generation. The reasoning is pragmatic. Without sufficient income, preservation becomes impossible. The house and landscape can be maintained only if the business thrives. This logic is sound, but it leads inexorably toward increasing commercialization. Each new revenue stream requires infrastructure that changes the character of the place. Each expansion of hospitality operations makes Biltmore more like a theme park and less like a historic estate. The trajectory is clear, even if each individual decision seems justified. December 2025. Western North Carolina. A steady stream of vehicles moves along the approach road through forests that have grown thick in the decades since George Vanderbilt's death. The road now accommodates thousands of cars daily, rather than the occasional carriage. Tour buses mix with family sedans and luxury vehicles. The entrance gatehouse, once staffed by a single watchman who knew every expected visitor by name, now processes ticketed guests through automated systems. The approach that Olmsted designed to create a sense of gradual transition from the outside world to a private domain now functions primarily as traffic management. The house appears through the trees, still massive, still impressive, still capable of inducing awe. The limestone glows in the winter light. Smoke rises from a few of the 65 chimneys. Though most are now purely decorative as modern heating systems have replaced the original steam radiators, the scale remains shocking. That one family built this, that it served primarily as a residence for perhaps 20 years, that it exists at all in the mountains of North Carolina, the improbability of it hits visitors who see it for the first time. Inside, tour groups move through the designated route. The rooms are roped off. Climate control systems hum quietly. Security cameras monitor constantly. Guards watch for anyone who might touch a surface or cross a barrier. The house operates as a machine for processing visitors, educational and impressive and profitable, but no longer a home. The library where George spent countless hours reading contains his books. It's carefully preserved behind glass, but no one sits in the leather chairs anymore. The banquet hall, which hosted elaborate dinners, now accommodates crowds who photograph the table set with china that's never used. The bedrooms where Edith and George and later Cornelia and her sons slept are frozen in time, perfect and dead. The guides, trained and knowledgeable, tell the story. George Vanderbilt's vision, the construction, the forestry programs, Edith's stewardship, the decision to open to the public, they emphasize survival, Adaptation. Success. Biltmore is presented as a triumph of preservation, an example of how historic properties can sustain themselves through tourism. The narrative is accurate, but incomplete. It doesn't dwell on the compromises, the losses, the fundamental transformation of purpose. It doesn't mention that George would likely be horrified to see strangers walking through his library, or that the estate he designed as an integrated whole has been reduced to its most marketable parts. Outside, the gardens maintain their designed beauty. The beds are immaculate, the shrubs precisely trimmed, the pathways swept clean. Groundskeepers work constantly, maintaining standards that equal anything in George's time. But they work for visitors now, not for a family. The gardens exist to be photographed, to provide a pleasant setting for walking, to enhance the visitor experience that generates the revenue that pays for their maintenance. The circular logic is perfect and empty. The winery, located in what were once the estate's agricultural buildings, produces very good wine. The tasting room is elegant and well-designed. The staff is professional. The operation honors the estate's farming tradition while generating substantial profit. But there's a certain absurdity to it. The grandson of America's richest man, who built a house the size of a small palace, would likely find it bizarre that his descendants' primary business is selling wine to tourists. The irony seems lost in the marketing materials. The question posed in the Mountain Air 130 years ago has been answered, though not in any way George Vanderbilt could have anticipated. What does it cost to keep a thing like this alive? Everything. It costs the transformation of its essential nature. It costs the abandonment of its original purpose. It costs the conversion from private sanctuary to public entertainment. It costs continuous compromise between preservation and commerce. It costs the acceptance that survival requires fundamental change. But Biltmore does survive, which distinguishes it from every other Vanderbilt mansion. The Breakers in Newport continues as a museum but owned by the Preservation Society of Newport County, not the family. Marble House, also in Newport, follows the same pattern. The New York mansions are gone, demolished decades ago, their sites now occupied by office buildings and apartments. The Hyde Park Mansion operates under the National Park Service. All the houses the Vanderbilts built to demonstrate and celebrate their wealth, only Biltmore remains under family control and economically self-sustaining. This survival represents a kind of success, but it also illuminates the futility of the original enterprise. George built Biltmore to last, to demonstrate that American wealth could create beauty and advance knowledge, to prove that private estates could model responsible land management. He succeeded in creating something magnificent. The house stands as testimony to what human effort and resources can achieve when directed with vision and persistence. But the survival required abandoning the principles that animated its creation. The estate that was supposed to prove the value of concentrated private wealth now survives only through commercial exploitation of its historic significance. The lesson operates on multiple levels. On the practical level, Biltmore demonstrates that historic properties can survive through tourism if managed professionally and capitalized adequately. The business model works. The preservation standards can be maintained. The employment benefits the region. The adaptation, however uncomfortable to contemplate, achieved its goal. On a deeper level, Biltmore's story reveals the unsustainability of the Gilded Age model of extreme wealth concentration. The Vanderbilt fortune, which seemed inexhaustible to those who inherited it, proved finite. The grand gestures, the enormous houses, the elaborate lifestyles, the private domains, required economic and social conditions that didn't persist. The great estates fell not because of revolution or confiscation, but because of prosaic pressures, taxes, operating costs, changing labor markets, shifts in social values. The system that made them possible evolved into a system that made them impossible. The choice Edith faced in 1930 between closing Biltmore or opening it to the public wasn't really a choice. The evolution of American society through the early 20th century made continuation as a private estate unsustainable, regardless of individual decisions. The tax structure of the modern state, designed to prevent the perpetuation of concentrated wealth across generations, worked exactly as intended. The social changes that made domestic service undesirable and expensive eliminated the cheap labor that great houses required. The cultural shifts that made extreme private luxury seem offensive rather than admirable removed the social acceptance that had protected such places. Biltmore survived by abandoning its original form and purpose, which means in a significant sense, it didn't really survive at all. What exists now is something different, a successful tourism business built around the preserved shell of a Gilded Age estate. It's beautiful, educational, economically beneficial, and well-managed. It employs thousands of people, it attracts millions of visitors, generates substantial revenue, and maintains high preservation standards. By any practical measure, it's a model of how to sustain a historic property in the modern world. But the house George Vanderbilt built, the private retreat where he intended to read and study and experiment with forestry and landscape design, where he hoped his descendants would continue his work across generations, that place is gone. It disappeared gradually, through a series of pragmatic decisions made under economic pressure over decades. Each change justified and necessary, until the accumulation of change created something entirely different. The transformation was survival, but survival redefined the thing being saved. The contradiction seems fundamental to all efforts to preserve the monuments of historical wealth inequality. We can maintain the buildings and landscapes, but we can't recreate the systems that produced them without recreating the exploitation and inequality those systems required. We can admire the craftsmanship and beauty while condemning the social conditions that made them possible. We can visit and learn and appreciate without endorsing the values that animated their creation. But we can't have it both ways. We can preserve great estates as functioning private domains while also maintaining the democratic and egalitarian values we claim to hold. Biltmore survives as a museum and business, which is perhaps the only form of survival compatible with modern American society. The tourists who visit, who pay their admission and walk through the rooms and photograph the gardens and buy wine and enjoy the experience, probably don't contemplate these tensions. They see a beautiful house, impressively preserved, providing entertainment and education. They appreciate the craftsmanship and the scale. They leave satisfied, having spent a pleasant day. The business model depends on this straightforward exchange: money for access, experience for revenue. But standing in the library, looking at the books George Vanderbilt collected and read, or walking the gardens his landscape architect designed, or viewing the forests his foresters managed, the ghost of the original intention remains visible. This was supposed to be something different. It was supposed to prove something about wealth and responsibility, about conservation and stewardship, about what one man with enormous resources could achieve for the public good while maintaining private control. The proof is mixed. The house stands, which is more than can be said for the others. The forests were preserved, though as public land rather than private. The demonstration of scientific forestry influenced national policy. The employment benefited the region. These outcomes matter. But the fundamental promise of Gilded Age wealth that private fortunes could serve public benefit through enlightened individual management failed the test of time. The estates couldn't sustain themselves. The fortunes dispersed across generations. The model of concentrated wealth producing lasting public benefit collapsed under its own contradictions and the weight of democratic reforms. Biltmore survives as evidence both of what was achieved and what was impossible to maintain. If you found value in this investigation into how the last Vanderbilt mansion survived through transformation and compromise, consider subscribing. Future episodes will examine other monuments of past eras that persist through adaptation: Eastern State Penitentiary, the Hoover Dam, the interstate highway system. Each represents a vision that could unsustain itself in its original form, but found ways to continue by accepting fundamental change. The lessons compound across examples, illuminating not just history, but the patterns that determine what survives and what the cost of that survival becomes. Suggest topics in the comments. The archives of the ambitious past contain endless examples of visions that exceeded their creators' ability to sustain them. Understanding how some adapted while others vanished may offer insights more valuable than either celebration or condemnation.